Hi, so welcome back to this next part of the series in building, magnetizing and painting the UCM faction from Dropzone Commander. You should be able to see here I've got the Albatross model, which I love so much, and I've primed it. I go about different methods of priming my models, and so I don't tend to just put one coat of primer on and just leave it. In this case, I've primed the entire model black and then given it a very light coat of grey primer. I use the Vallejo primers. Let me just show you that. So I've got both of them here. So this is the, let me just get that into the camera. Yeah. So this is the black one. Just move the camera up a little bit. See, that's been well used. This has served me quite well over the last at least a year, I guess. One of the advantages of airbrush primers is that they go a really long way. A little bit goes a really long way, and for that reason alone, I think it's superior to the aerosol primers. The aerosol primers tend to be a lot tougher, in my experience, but they do suffer from environmental factors. So if it's raining outside or if it's very humid, it's not ideal to use an aerosol primer, whereas you have a lot more control indoors using an airbrush primer. So I'm rambling again. Let's talk about the next bit. So that's the black primer. I've got the light grey primer as well. And so yeah, so I airbrushed a black primer first, and then a light coat of light grey primer. And so the reason for that is that it just lets me see the detail on the model. When you've got just one homogeneous colour all the way across, it hides all of that detail, and it means that it's much more difficult to plan out where you're going to put the next stage, the base paint stage. And for me, I just like seeing the detail, just because it lets me plan out. It gives me what I call slightly pompously a tonal map of the model, so I can choose whereabouts I want the dark bits, where I want the light bits to be, and it just gives me a bit more to go on. And so that's the reason for doing that. Let me show you the rest of these primed models, because one of the things that I'm pleased with is the fact that the magnets that we talked about in the previous videos are blending in quite nicely. And so you might remember from the previous video, the magnets were actually standing out quite harshly on the white plastic and resin of the models. The dark shiny metallic colour of the magnets was sitting there in stark contrast. But now you can see, although you can still see the magnets, let's just bring this one up here, you can still see the magnet on the model, but it blends in much better now that we've got a kind of more uniform colour across the entire thing. So I'm very, very pleased with that. I did have one question, I think it was on Facebook, on my Facebook page, just asking whether I was worried about the paint chipping off of the magnets, and it was a good question, because until I was asked, I hadn't really given it that much consideration, but my response to that is that what I'm going to do after the paint job is complete is to apply a very thin layer of PVA glue to the magnets, so that it just gives it an extra layer of protection. It will already have had a couple of layers of paint, it will already have had a couple of layers of varnish, but that PVA layer should give it that much, a little bit of armour protection almost, and that will help. Over time, of course, yes, paint will fade and chip away from the magnets, especially if they're used repeatedly. But this will just give a little extra degree of protection. Let me just show you a couple of other models here. So yeah, so this is just the black primer with a light grey coat. This one shows up the detail particularly well, and we really wouldn't be able to see that if it was just one homogeneous colour. And it's important to point out, this isn't necessary. I don't think this is something that you feel that you should feel that you have to do. It's just a personal preference of mine, because I just like seeing the detail on the models. It just helps me plan out the next steps a little bit easier. So yeah, so what I'm going to do next is put on the base layer. I'm going to start shooting that video in a moment. I'm just going to explain briefly what I'm going to do. I'm going to use a color modulation set from AK Interactive. Let me just show you those now. So let's bring those into the camera. In fact, let me get these guys out of the way. So yeah, so what I'm using are these colours from AK Interactive, and these are from the Panzer Grey colour modulation set, and that's a lot of long words. And you may not have heard of colour modulation before, but colour modulation is where you build up the brighter tones on the model. So you have a dark base layer, so this one's called Dunkelgrau shadow, so dark grey shadow. So that's going to be the first one that I apply, and then I'm going to lighten it slightly. So just in certain areas I'm going to go in with this lighter colour, Dunkelgrau base. So that's just ever so slightly lighter, and then again just proceed lighter and lighter. And the idea of colour modulation is that you lighten tones on certain areas of the model to give more contrast and to give more depth and volume to the model. It's something that I'm really keen on. It's one of the advantages of using an airbrush, because not only is it a fun technique to use, you can get great results from it. It's really a way to stop the model from looking too flat. It's not necessarily a realistic technique, but it gives the impression of realism. It gives the impression that the model is more detailed perhaps than it is, and for those models that are detailed, it enhances that detail, and that's why I'm a big fan of this technique. So that's very complicated to explain. It's much easier to show you, and that's what I'm going to do in the next step. So I'm going to be airbrushing. I'm not going to be talking because there's going to be fans and compressors, and I'll be wearing a respirator as I always do when I'm airbrushing. So I'm actually going to be doing a voiceover for that portion of the video, which it might sound a bit more weird, but it also will hopefully sound more practiced and a bit more professional. So thanks very much, and we'll see you in the next part.